The River Liffey curves through the heart of Ireland's capital, music its dark waters reflecting a city caught between past and future. Dublin Castle rises on the southern bank, seat of British power in Ireland. Church spires puncture the skyline. Ships crowd the quays where merchants and labourers jostle for space. This was Dublin in 1700, a city about to transform itself from a medieval backwater into one of the great capitals of Europe. Within decades, these narrow streets would give way to grand boulevards and elegant squares. But that transformation would come at a cost. The city we're looking at now is still recovering from war. Just a decade earlier, in 1690, the Battle of the Boyne changed Ireland's fate. William of Orange defeated the Catholic King James II, solidifying Protestant control over the island. Dublin felt the aftershocks. Catholic property was confiscated, new laws restricted their rights, and power concentrated in Protestant hands. The penal laws were tightening their grip, designed to keep Catholics poor, powerless, and excluded from public life. They couldn't own land above a certain value, couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't practice law. The system was deliberate and brutal. Yet Dublin was growing. Money was flowing in, estates were expanding, and the Protestant Ascendancy, as they called themselves, were building a capital to match their ambitions. From this point forward, I'll guide you through Dublin as it evolved across the 18th century using paintings, maps and engravings to move through streets that no longer exist and stand in spaces that have been transformed beyond recognition. The goal isn't just to observe the past, but to step into it, to walk through Dublin as it once was, and imagine what it might have felt like to be there. This view shows Dublin from the Phoenix Park looking southeast toward the city centre in the early 1700s. The park itself was already one of the largest enclosed public spaces in Europe, originally a royal hunting ground. From this vantage point you can see how compact Dublin still was. Church spires mark the old medieval core. Smoke rises from countless chimneys. The city hugs the river, stretching east toward the sea but not yet sprawling beyond its traditional bounds. Within a generation, this view would change dramatically as the city exploded outward. The River Liffey was Dublin's lifeline and its burden. Every ship, every cargo, every traveller from abroad came up this river. But the Liffey was shallow, unpredictable and prone to flooding. At low tide, mud banks emerged, making navigation treacherous. The quays were primitive, little more than dirt paths where goods were unloaded directly onto muddy ground. Merchants complained constantly. The city needed modern infrastructure if it wanted to compete with London, Bristol or Edinburgh. That would come, but slowly. This map captures Dublin in the early decades of the century. The medieval street pattern dominates. Narrow lanes wind through the area south of the river, clustering around Christ Church Cathedral and Dublin Castle. North of the Liffey, development was sparse. Open fields stretched toward the village of Drumcondra. The city was still small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour. But look closely at the edges of this map. New streets are appearing, new squares are planned. The Georgian transformation was beginning. Dublin Castle has stood on this site since the early 13th century, though what we see in the 1700s is largely rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1684. By the 18th century it was the administrative heart of British rule in Ireland. The Lord Lieutenant lived here when he was in residence. Government offices filled its rooms. Courts met within its walls. For Irish Catholics, this building represented exclusion and oppression. For the Protestant elite, it was the centre of power and privilege. State balls were held here. Grand receptions, displays of wealth and authority meant to reinforce who controlled Ireland. Standing in the castle's courtyard, you would have felt the weight of empire. British soldiers guarded the gates. Officials hurried between buildings carrying documents that decided the fate of thousands. Outside these walls the city continued, but inside, Ireland's future was being written by a small group of men who answered to London, not Dublin. This is Christ Church Cathedral, one of Dublin's two medieval cathedrals, founded in 1030 but heavily rebuilt in the centuries since. By the 1700s it stood as the established Church of Ireland Cathedral, firmly Protestant despite its ancient Catholic origins. The building dominated the skyline of Old Dublin, perched on high ground with its distinctive tower visible from across the city. The area around it was dense and chaotic. Narrow streets, crowded markets, tenements leaning against each other. This was the old Dublin, the medieval city that was slowly being abandoned by the wealthy as they moved to newer districts. Christ Church saw its congregation change over the century. As the wealthy moved north and east to the new Georgian squares, the cathedral's neighbourhood declined. By the late 1700s, the Liberties, the district surrounding it, had become one of Dublin's poorest areas. Weavers, labourers, and the destitute filled streets that had once housed merchants and guild members. The cathedral remained, but its world was shifting. Now we move to St Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin's other great medieval church. Unlike Christ Church, St Patrick's stood just outside the old city walls in an area called the Liberties. By the 18th century, it too served the Church of Ireland, and for a time, Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, served as its dean from 1713 until his death in 1745. Swift was a fierce defender of Irish interests, even as a Protestant and an Englishman by birth. He wrote scathing satires attacking British exploitation of Ireland and became beloved for his charity work in Dublin. Walking through St Patrick's Close in the 1720s or 1730s, you might have glimpsed Swift himself, a man equally at home with the elite in drawing rooms and the poor in the streets. The cathedral stood in a working district. Huguenot weavers, refugees from France, had settled nearby in the Liberties, bringing their skills and their Protestant faith. They transformed the textile industry and left their mark on Dublin's culture. The sound of looms echoed through these streets, mixing with the calls of street vendors and the clatter of carts. Let me show you Trinity College as it appeared in the mid-1700s. Founded in 1592 by Queen Elizabeth I, Trinity was Ireland's only university and a bastion of Protestant privilege. Catholics were officially barred from attending, though this rule was sometimes quietly bent. The college stood east of the medieval city, surrounded by open ground that was rapidly being developed into elegant streets and squares. The college's front square, Parliament Square, was taking its final Georgian form during this period. Students from across Ireland and Britain came here to study classics, theology, philosophy and law. The atmosphere would have been both scholarly and exclusive. Young men from landowning families walked these cobbled yards, their futures secure in a system designed to keep power in their hands. Yet Trinity also produced some of Ireland's greatest thinkers and rebels. Edmund Burke, the philosopher, studied here. Theobald Wolfe Tone, who would lead the 1798 rebellion, was a Trinity graduate. The college was meant to reinforce the establishment, but it also created the minds that would question it. This engraving shows us Leinster House, built between 1745 and 1747 for James Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare, and later Duke of Leinster. At the time, it was considered madness to build so far from the fashionable areas south of the river. The Earl famously declared that wherever he built, fashion would follow. He was right. Within years, the area around Leinster House became the most sought-after address in Dublin. Grand townhouses rose on Merrion Square and Fitzwilliam Square. The wealthy abandoned the old districts entirely. Leinster House itself was designed by Richard Castles, one of the leading architects of Georgian Dublin. Its facade was imposing but refined, classical without being cold. Later, it would become the seat of the Irish Parliament, a role it still holds today. But in the 1750s and 1760s, it was simply the grandest private residence in Ireland, a statement of wealth and taste that reshaped the city around it. Now we turn to one of Dublin's most ambitious projects, the Wide Streets Commission. Established in 1757, this body had extraordinary powers to demolish old buildings, widen streets, and impose order on the medieval tangle of lanes. Their first major project was widening Dame Street, creating a grand approach from Trinity College to Dublin Castle. Next came Sackville Street, now called O'Connell Street, which became one of the widest boulevards in Europe. The Commission didn't ask permission. If a building stood in the way, it was torn down, and compensation was minimal. Entire neighbourhoods vanished. The medieval city was being erased block by block, replaced with straight lines, uniform facades, and neoclassical symmetry. For the wealthy, this was progress, proof that Dublin could rival any European capital. For the displaced poor, it was devastation. They were pushed to the edges, to the Liberties, to the tenements that were already overcrowded and disease-ridden. This view shows the new custom house under construction in the 1780s, designed by James Gandon, another architect who defined Georgian Dublin. The Custom House was controversial from the start. Merchants downstream opposed it, fearing it would shift trade away from their docks. The project went ahead anyway, and the result was magnificent. A massive neoclassical building crowned with a copper dome, it dominated the riverfront and announced Dublin's arrival as a modern commercial capital. Gandon's work didn't stop there. He also designed the Four Courts, the great legal complex on the north bank of the Liffey, completed in 1802 but begun in the 1780s. Both buildings still stand today, defining Dublin's skyline just as they did over 2 centuries ago. They represent the peak of Dublin's Georgian ambitions, a city that believed it was destined for greatness. But let's not forget who paid for all this grandeur. Ireland's wealth came from agriculture, vast estates worked by tenant farmers who had almost no rights. Rents were high, leases were short, and eviction was common. The money that built these elegant squares and neoclassical monuments was extracted from the countryside and concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite. Dublin glittered, but rural Ireland suffered. Let me take you to Merrion Square, perhaps the finest of Dublin's Georgian squares. Developed in the 1760s and 1770s, it epitomised the era's architectural ideals. Uniform red brick townhouses lined each side, their doorways adorned with fanlight windows, decorative ironwork and brightly painted doors. Each house was a statement of wealth and taste, yet all conformed to strict design rules that created visual harmony. Walking through Merrion Square in 1780, you would have seen servants polishing door knockers, carriages arriving for afternoon calls, children playing in the central garden under the watch of nursemaids. This was a world of strict social codes. Who you knew, where you lived, and how you presented yourself determined your place in society. The square was exclusive by design. Catholics, no matter how wealthy, were largely unwelcome. Jews faced similar barriers. This was Protestant Dublin at its most refined and most insular. Yet even here cracks were showing. By the 1780s and 1790s, some members of the Protestant elite were questioning the system. The penal laws seemed increasingly indefensible. Why exclude talented Catholics from public life? Why deny them property rights? A reform movement was growing, cautiously at first, pushing for Catholic relief and greater Irish autonomy. These ideas were debated in the coffeehouses and drawing rooms of Merrion Square, even as the square itself remained a symbol of exclusion. Now I want to bring you to the Irish Parliament House, one of the most important buildings in 18th century Dublin. Completed in 1739 and designed by Edward Lovett Pearce, it was the first purpose-built Parliament building in the world. The House of Lords met in a magnificent octagonal chamber, while the House of Commons gathered in a separate hall. Both were lavishly decorated, befitting a parliament that saw itself as equal to Westminster. But this was not a democratic institution. Only Protestant men who owned substantial property could vote or serve. Catholics were excluded entirely. The Irish Parliament answered to the British Crown, and key decisions were still made in London. Nonetheless, the Parliament gave Dublin a sense of importance. Grand debates unfolded here. In the 1780s, under the leadership of Henry Grattan, the Parliament won legislative independence from Britain, though the victory was short-lived. Standing in the public gallery in 1790, you would have heard passionate speeches about Ireland's future. Some called for greater Catholic rights, others defended the status quo. The building hummed with ambition and anxiety. Many in that chamber understood that the system couldn't last, but few could agree on what should replace it. Within a decade, fear of revolution would change everything. The 1790s brought upheaval. The French Revolution terrified the ruling class. In Ireland, radical groups like the United Irishmen, led by Wolfe Tone, called for complete independence and the end of sectarian division. They sought French support and planned a rebellion. The government responded with brutal repression. Habeas corpus was suspended. Suspected rebels were arrested, tortured and executed. Dublin filled with soldiers. In 1798, the rebellion finally erupted. Fighting spread across Ireland, but the rebels were poorly armed and badly coordinated. The rising was crushed within months. Thousands died. Wolfe Tone was captured and committed suicide before he could be executed. The rebellion failed, but it shook British confidence in Ireland's loyalty. The British response was decisive. In 1800, the Act of Union dissolved the Irish Parliament and merged Ireland directly into the United Kingdom. The Parliament building in Dublin was sold. The politicians went home. Dublin's brief moment as a capital with its own legislature was over. The building that had symbolised Irish ambitions now stood empty, a monument to what might have been. Let me take you back to the streets themselves, away from grand buildings and political drama. Daily life in 18th century Dublin was a mix of elegance and squalor, often on the same block. Street vendors shouted their wares. Sedan chairs carried wealthy ladies through crowded lanes. Beggars huddled in doorways. The smell of coal smoke, horse dung, and open sewers hung in the air. Public executions were common. Crowds gathered to watch hangings outside Newgate Prison, treating them as grim entertainment. Poverty was visible everywhere. Children worked as chimney sweeps, their lungs slowly destroyed by soot. Women sold oysters and milk from carts. Labourers lined up at dawn hoping for a day's work. The city's wealth was built on their backs, but they saw little of it. Yet there was also vibrancy. Theatres thrived. The Smock Alley Theatre drew crowds with plays by Shakespeare, Sheridan and contemporary Irish playwrights. Music filled taverns. Dublin's literary culture was already strong, producing writers who would shape English literature for generations. Coffeehouses buzzed with conversation, gossip and political debate. The city had energy, ambition, and a sense that it was part of something larger. By 1800, Dublin stood transformed. The medieval city was almost unrecognisable. Wide streets had replaced narrow lanes. Elegant squares stood where fields had been. The population had swelled to nearly 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in the British Isles. But the century ended in disappointment. The Parliament was gone. Political power had shifted to London. Dublin was no longer a capital in the same sense. Still, the physical city remained. The Georgian architecture that defined 18th century Dublin still defines much of it today. Merrion Square, Fitzwilliam Square, the Custom House, the Four Courts, Trinity College, all of these survived wars, revolutions and modernisation. Walking through Dublin now, you can still trace the 1700s in its bones. Let me bring you into the present and show how these places look today. This is Christ Church Cathedral, still standing on the same high ground where it dominated medieval Dublin. The building was heavily restored in the 1870s, but its basic form remains recognisable. The streets around it have changed completely. Where tenements once crowded, modern buildings and wide roads now surround the cathedral, but if you stand in the right spot you can still glimpse the old skyline. St Patrick's Cathedral looks much as it did in the 18th century, though it too underwent Victorian restoration. The Liberties around it are quieter now, no longer the centre of Dublin's weaving trade. The cathedral sits in a more residential area, surrounded by a mix of old and new. Jonathan Swift is buried inside, his legacy preserved in the building he served. Trinity College has expanded far beyond its 18th century footprint, but the core remains. Parliament Square, the rubrics, the campanile, all evoke the Georgian University. Modern students walk the same paths as their 18th century predecessors, though the student body is now open to all religions, genders and backgrounds. The exclusivity is gone, but the architecture endures. Leinster House still stands on Kildare Street, and it still serves as a parliament building. Now home to the Oireachtas, the Irish legislature. The grand townhouses around Merrion Square and Fitzwilliam Square are mostly offices now. Their domestic life faded, but the facades remain, red brick and bright doors forming one of Europe's finest Georgian streetscapes. The Custom House gleams on the north bank of the Liffey, restored after being burned during the Irish Civil War in 1921. It no longer handles customs, but it remains a government building and one of Dublin's most photographed landmarks. Nearby, the Four Courts also survived the Civil War, though just barely. Both buildings anchor the riverfront much as they did in the 1790s. The old Parliament House became the Bank of Ireland after 1800. It still serves that function today, though parts are open to the public. You can visit the House of Lords chamber, its original decoration preserved. Standing there, you can almost hear the debates that once filled the room, the arguments over independence, rights, and Ireland's future. O'Connell Street, once Sackville Street, is still one of Dublin's main thoroughfares. It was destroyed during the 1916 Easter Rising and rebuilt, losing much of its Georgian character, but its width, its scale, remains a legacy of the Wide Streets Commission. The boulevard they created still shapes how people move through the city. Walking through Dublin today, the 18th century is everywhere if you know where to look. In the doorways of Merrion Square, in the curve of the Custom House dome, in the cobblestones of Trinity College. Dublin became a Georgian city in the 1700s, and in many ways it still is. The buildings remain, witnesses to a century of transformation, ambition, conflict, and compromise. Thank you for walking through this city with me. If you have thoughts, corrections, or ideas for future videos, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Until next time.